Grade 7, The Valley of Fear by Arthur Conan Doyle. Act 1, Scene 14. Read aloud. For more videos on the same topic and many other novels and play scripts, please subscribe my channel, Learners on Board. Scene 14, Burlstone Manor, 1895, The Study. Ames is picked out in a spotlight. No one else is visible. Ames, directly to the audience, but as though addressing the detectives. There's very little to add to what I have already told you, gentlemen, only that, the day before this terrible crime, Mr. Douglas went shopping in Tunbridge Wells. He seemed impatient and irritable on his return, which was unusual with him. The events after the murder are as I told you. I saw Mr. Barker prevent Mrs. Douglas from going into the study. Barker, in darkness as though talking to Mrs. Douglas. For God's sake, go back to your room. Poor Jack is dead. You can do nothing. Go back. Ames, directly to the audience, as though answering a question. No, gentlemen. Mrs. Douglas didn't seem particularly agitated by the awful event. If that's all you require of me, I shall tell the housekeeper, Mrs. Ellen, to come to the dining room. Spotlight goes down on Ames, who goes off as another spotlight comes up on Mrs. Ellen. Mrs. Ellen, directly to the audience as though addressing the detectives. The first I knew of it was Mr. Barker ringing the bell. My room is not so far from the study as Mr. Ames's room, but I didn't hear the shot, only the bell. You see, I'm a little hard of hearing. She leans forward, as though trying to hear a question. Excuse me, gentlemen. Now understanding. Oh, my hearing isn't what you could call bad. In fact, a door slamming at one point in the evening almost made me jump out of my skin. That was a good deal earlier, mind. At least half an hour before the bell. It is a terrible business, isn't it? I'm only glad that Mrs. Douglas let me lead her away from the room. She made no attempt to see her husband, and that is really all I can tell you. Shall I ask Mr. Parker to step through? Spotlight down on Mrs. Ellen, who goes off as a spotlight comes up on Cecil Barker. Barker, directly to the audience as though addressing the detectives. Originally, I met John Douglas in California. He would come there from the coal and iron fields. He was a widower then. His first wife had died of typhoid the year before I met him. I remember his saying she was of Swedish extraction. Douglas and I worked together on a mining claim in the Benito Canyon. He avoided the company of other men if he could. Some remarks he made suggested that a type of secret society, some implacable organization, was on his track and would never rest till it killed him. He never told me what the society was, but I believe he received a warning of some sort while we were in California. That's why he left for Europe so suddenly. 6 years ago now. Holmes, in darkness. And when did you come back to England, Mr. Barker? Full lights up, revealing Holmes and MacDonald questioning Barker. Barker, a year later. MacDonald, you must have returned about the time of his marriage. Barker, perhaps a month before. I was his best man. MacDonald, did you know Mrs. Douglas before her marriage? Barker, no, I did not. MacDonald, but you have seen a great deal of her since. Barker, offended. You cannot visit a man without knowing his wife, but if you imagine there is any connection. MacDonald, I imagine nothing, Mr. Barker. I am bound to make every inquiry which can bear upon the case. Holmes. The inspector means no offense. Barker. Some inquiries are offensive. MacDonald. Calmly. Did Mr. Douglas entirely approve your friendship with his wife? Barker. Angrily. You have no right to ask such questions. MacDonald glances significantly at Holmes. Barker regains his composure. Well, I guess you gentlemen are only doing your duty. MacDonald. That's right, sir. Barker. Poor Douglas had just one fault in the world, and that was his jealousy. He was fond of me, and no one could be more devoted to his wife. And yet, if he saw us talking together, a wave of jealousy would pass over him, and he would say the wildest things. MacDonald. I see. You are aware that the dead man's wedding ring has been taken from his finger? Barker. So it appears. MacDonald. What do you mean, appears? You know it is a fact. Barker. Awkwardly. I meant that it was conceivable that he had himself taken off the ring. MacDonald. The mere fact that the ring should be absent, whoever may have removed it, would suggest that the marriage and the tragedy are connected, would it not? Parker. I can't profess to say what it suggests. Angrily. But if you mean it reflects in any way on Mrs. Douglas' honor, well, you are on the wrong track. That's all. MacDonald. I have nothing else to ask at present, Mr. Holmes. Holmes. There was one small point. When you entered the room, there was a candle lighted upon the table. Was there not? Parker. Yes. Holmes. By its light, you saw that some terrible incident had occurred. Barker. Exactly. Holmes. You rang at once for help and it arrived speedily? Barker. Yes. Holmes. And yet, when they arrived, they found the candle was out and the lamp had been lit. That seems very remarkable. Barker. Awkwardly. No remark, not remarkable, Mr. Holmes. The candle threw a very bad light. The lamp was on the table, so I lit it. Holmes. And blew out the candle? Parker. Exactly. Now, if that's all, am I free to leave? Holmes. Certainly. Thank you, Mr. Barker. Barker starts to exit. MacDonald. To Holmes. I have sent word to Mrs. Douglas that we'll speak her in her room. Mrs. Douglas. Coming on. No need, Inspector. Mrs. Douglas exchanges a brief, questioning glance with Barker, and then goes off. Mrs. Douglas approaches MacDonald and Holmes. Have you found out anything yet? Holmes. Perhaps you can tell us something which may throw light upon the matter. Mrs. Douglas. I fear not, but all I know is at your service. MacDonald. I understand you first met Mr. Douglas in a London boarding house and became engaged to him there. Mrs. Douglas. Yes. MacDonald. Was there any romance? Anything secret or mysterious about the wedding? Mrs. Douglas. There was romance. There's always romance. There was nothing mysterious. MacDonald. He had no rival? Mrs. Douglas. No. I was quite free. MacDonald. You have heard, no doubt, that his wedding ring has been taken. Does that suggest anything to you? Mrs. Douglas. Almost amused. I really cannot tell. It is certainly the most extraordinary thing. Holmes. Mrs. Douglas. Did your husband ever speak of anything that occurred during his life in America which might bring to me which might bring some danger on him? Mrs. Douglas. Yes, I have always felt there was a danger hanging over him. MacDonald. What kind of danger? Mrs. Douglas. He refused to discuss it with me, not from what not from want of confidence in me, but out of his desire to keep all alarm from me. MacDonald. How did you know there was a danger then? Mrs. Douglas. Smiling briefly. Can a husband carry a secret all his life and a woman who loves him have no suspicion of it? I knew it in many ways, by certain precautions he took, the way he looked at unexpected strangers, certain words he let fall. Holmes. Might I ask which words attracted your attention? Mrs. Douglas. The valley of fear. That was an expression he used when I questioned him. I have been in the valley of fear. I'm not out of it yet. Holmes. Surely you asked what he meant by that? Mrs. Douglas. I did, but his face would become very grave. He would shake his head and tell me no more. Holmes. And he never mentioned any names? Mrs. Douglas. Once, delirious with fear after a hunting accident, he spoke with a sort of horror of Bodymaster McGinty. When he recovered, I asked who Bodymaster McGinty was and whose body he was master of. Never of mine, thank God, was the only answer I could get. But I believe that for the last 20 years of his life, my husband was haunted by these two things alone: Bodymaster McGinty and the Valley of Fear. Blackout. For more videos on the same topic and many other novels and play scripts, please subscribe my channel, Learners on Board. Thank you for watching.